Before we begin, could we ask all the people, and you all have cell phones, so please switch them off. Don't forget to turn them on once this is over. My name is Dore Gold. I'm at the head of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and we are opening our joint conference with the Israeli Association for Defense Against Missiles. And this is, of course, the topic of the day, as the critical need for Israel's security. We've got friends from overseas here, in Las Vegas here. The question that arises why we are holding this meeting here, this conference here, as a topic of defense against missiles isn't a new one, and the threat of missiles isn't a new one. I believe that Israel has been thinking about missile defense since the 80s, when Saddam Hussein launched Al-Hussein missiles towards Tehran during the Iran-Iraq war. And people who looked into the range up to Tehran understood immediately that 650 kilometers away from Iraq, they can be directed westward towards Tel Aviv. In 1985, too, the Reagan administration invited the State of Israel, together with 18 allies, to be a partner of the U.S. in the SDI program's Strategic Defense Initiative that is known as Star Wars. And over the years, Israel became the most important partner in this program. It's part of strategic partners of the U.S. outside the U.S., especially in the ATVM anti-tank missile defense. Despite the background, there is something new that is developing in our neighborhood, in our environment and around us. In the past, Israel had to cope in 1973 with the threat of Scuds from Egypt, from Frog missiles from Syria, also on the Yom Kippur War, but except for offensive of Katyushas every other year from the southern Lebanese area, from 1973 on, when the first Scuds were launched against Israeli objectives, up to the 90s in the Gulf War, actually 18 years went by. And we didn't have to cope with this problem at such high frequency. We saw the change, the great change, in the threat mainly of rockets against Israel in the Second Lebanon War, when Hezbollah succeeded in launching not only short-term rockets, the Katyusha, but the long-term, long-range ones that could make it to the center of the country. Simultaneously, the Hamas was developing the Qassam rocket, and the use of Hamas rockets became a daily threat on the western Negev and the town of Sderot. We're not speaking about a one-off event once every 18 years or a threat that evolves once a decade, but a threat that we need to handle every day. So the depth of the threat and the frequency of the threat have changed. Beyond this, the threats of missiles in the past and of rockets stemmed mainly from states. When there is a state, a hostile state, like in the past, like Egypt during the Yom Kippur War, or Syria in the same war, they were states. And after the military conflict, they are actually locked within agreements, ceasefire agreements, or resolutions of the Security Council. So it was much tougher on them to use the threat at higher frequency. They were limited. They had their constraints. Conversely, when the threat derives from terror organization, this is a completely different bag of worms. The Hezbollah does not have to uphold for years the understandings that were achieved by the Clinton establishment, where the Syrians can easily gnaw at them. Or if the Security Council passes a resolution regarding South Lebanon that is supposed to limit the Hezbollah, they are just not being carried out. Finally, Hezbollah set itself free from all these political limitations. The Hamas, too, every 6 months or a year, they are committed to the Hadiyah or a Hudna. But this is not a ceasefire agreement between two states. Therefore, Hamas feel free to use rockets against Israel without fearing the breach of written accords. Beyond that, those organizations too have the backup of a local superpower called Iran. Iran is interested in lack of stability in the region in order for it to cause the collapse of the order that the West and Europe and the United States were guaranteeing for. When the idea was developed of missile defense in the 80s, in the West and mainly in the US, the United States found itself in what I call a strategic corner. And what do I mean by that? At that time of the late 70s and early 80s, the former Soviet Union succeeded in becoming stronger with offensive missiles, succeeded in breaking through with nuclear warheads in large quantities. So even when the Reagan administration came up with the idea of missile defense, the Soviets had a supremacy in numbers vis-à-vis the United States with nuclear missiles, and they succeeded in translating this advantage in a freedom of action and more leeway in Angola, Afghanistan, in the Third World in general. The U.S. had a dilemma, a very tough one, because it was not easy for American administrations to pass legislation in Congress in order to fund offensive missiles as a response to the Soviet missiles. The Soviets could build more and more missiles, and the U.S. found it quite difficult because the Congress wanted to have restriction. The Congress also demanded oversight and arms control. So the strategic situation of the U.S. was very difficult, and the U.S. had to find a way out and find itself more able to take care of the Soviet threat. The SDI program of President Reagan became a new factor, a new bargaining chip between the superpowers, despite the fact that the U.S. did not develop an operative system of substance and actually succeeded in initiating only a development program. The threat that the U.S. faced of deploying a defensive system in the future changed the balance between the two superpowers. Only with the determination to present a defensive system did the administration succeed in taking the U.S. from this strategic corner that the United States was painted in during the 70s and the 80s. And at the end of the day, when the Soviets realized that the United States indeed was interested in developing anti-missile systems, did the Soviets gradually accept to negotiate an IMF and START agreement, and in the end they internalized the fact that they could not compete with the technological supremacy of the United States. I would like to propose, for the sake of our discussion here, that to some extent the rocket threat posed Israel in some kind of very difficult strategic corner. The Hamas movement and other Islamic organizations understand that there are limitations on Israeli response and that Qassam rockets fired against Israel are also restricted. Although Hamas can direct the fire of the Qassam against a civil population, they know that Israel will not retaliate, will not respond by directing the IDF fire at Palestinian civilians. The Hezbollah, too, takes into account this consideration. Moreover, the Hamas understand the limitation that Israel has as far as using ground forces in response for Qassam rockets fired at Israel. They know that Israeli public opinion, there is no wish to go back to the Gaza Strip. And thus, a difficult strategic situation evolved that Israel cannot include all its responses against Hamas, whereas Hamas can go on and use the rockets against Sderot, against the western Negev, whereas Israel does not respond. I believe that there is a price that Israel is paying because of this absence of response to the Hamas and other organizations' rockets. The neighboring states, who do have the option of much more sophisticated missile systems than Hamas has, those states, those countries, see that Israeli civilian objectives can be attacked without Israel responding. This must have its impact on the deterrence of the neighboring countries. And thus, the difficult situation of Sderot finally does have an impact on the security situation of Tel Aviv. And even more importantly, the missile offensive that recur can also erode the trust of the public in the ability of the government to protect the state over time, not at once. And this gives a huge advantage to these arms in the Hamas and other organizations' hands. If the goal of terror organizations and terror activities is to bring about a situation where civilians lose their trust in the ability of the government to defend them, the rocket becomes a terror weapon which is perfect. But what would happen if Israel could pose defensive system within 18 months or 2 years that could give a response of defense from rockets? What can this do to Hamas and Jihad Islami and other organizations' tactics and strategy? Would they have the feeling that they can go on and invest in rockets as a preferred weapon? Why invest in rockets if Israel can take advantage of this in the near future? The United States determined its technological supremacy vis-à-vis the former Soviet Union with the SDI program, as I explained, without even deploying one SDI system. And thereby the U.S. changed the battlefield, and actually the competition, the strategic competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, maybe to the extent that systems against those rockets of the various organizations around it can be developed, Israel could change the strategic equation and snap out of this corner that it was pushed into, or that it pushed itself into in last years. Only one word of caution. In my view, defense against missiles and rockets is no substitute for the use of other offensive means. The goal of defensive systems has to be to perfect, to complete Israel's ability to defend itself. To a large extent, those defensive systems of the U.S. did not replace the concept of deterrence of the U.S., but strengthened it. You can see defense systems against rockets as a substitute for the protection of the entire South, but not as a substitute for Israel's ability to defend itself in the traditional way. I would like to stress that the right to self-defense, to the extent that a country is being attacked, still exists in international law if there is a state, a sustained aggression, a defense system, or it doesn't have a defense system, the very attack, offensive, is a violation of international law. This conference will try to weigh and consider these as well as other topics. We would like to understand the implications of the new technologies, whether indeed there are technologies that could give an answer to the rocket threat. The various speakers will analyze the existing threat as well as try to consider whether there is a need for developing and deploying a defense system against the threat. They will also consider whether the investment in defense systems has to change the structure of power of the IDF or of the entire security system. And finally, after all, we are going also to consider what technologies exist today, what technologies can be relied on for the years to come, as well as budgetary implications of all that. Before I pass the floor to Uzi Eilam, I'd like to tell you that unfortunately Dore Eilam let us know only last night that he couldn't make it today for medical reasons. And Eitan Ben Eliyahu also let us know that he unfortunately can't make it. The other speakers know it, and they can maybe speak about some parallel topics that were to be covered by those two speakers. I would like now to invite Brigadier General Uzi Eilam, who represents AID, that is our partner in today's conference.
Thank you very much. Good morning, one and all, and welcome. Those who came from close by, from Jerusalem and from Tel Aviv, and those who've come from abroad, thank you. And thank you to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and its president, Dore Gold, for its collaboration with our new association, the IMDA, whose first event is taking place today. A very special thank you to the CEO, to Avi Schneur, and to his deputy, Mr. Oppenheim, who have been burning the midnight oil in order to generate the activities of this center and this association, and they made sure that this would truly take place. Just a few short words, and then I will let those various speakers from the other sessions to really say what truly fascinates and interests us. But one cannot go by without saying that there are no controversies in Israel about the missile threat. We experienced that on our own bodies. The Scuds in the first Gulf War, they landed here, and we suffered very direly in the Second Lebanon War as well. Hundreds of rockets, the barrage of them that were hurting, damage and causing tremendous collateral damage and more in the north of the country, and now in Sderot and in the settlements surrounding the Gaza Strip. And this threat does exist. I don't think that one needs to persuade either the decision makers, the powers to be, or the civilians that this is an ongoing threat and will be dragged into our future as well. So what does one need to do? What does one do when when there's a lull, for example? What happens when we withdrew from Lebanon, and we hoped, we believed that this sort of collection of Katyushas would not be used, but they were used. So what then happened to us when there was a lull of the Katyushas from Lebanon after Kiryat Shmona had been attacked so direly, and we suddenly realized there were different priorities in our security system. And what will happen if there's a lull for a month or 2 or 3 in Sderot? Suddenly again the priorities could possibly change. So our association, the Jerusalem, the IMDA, the Jerusalem Center, and the Israel Missile Defense Association will continue reminding people, reiterating the fact that this threat is hovering above us. It will deepen its research that will assist those political powers to be that will understand we need to be well equipped the entire time and ready and alert, that this threat is just a beginning. So therefore, this is just the beginning of our commitment, but with tremendous determination and hope in our association. And I sincerely hope that this will not only be a fruitful and interesting conference, but we will continue gathering momentum, and we will be able to see the fruit of our efforts. Thank you.